Right. Are we going? I presume so.
I think
Welcome,
we are.
everyone. Awesome. Hey, look, welcome, everyone, to this evening's webinar. And it's my privilege to host tonight's webinar in conjunction with Carbon Crop. And it's a great pleasure to have Rowan Sprague with us tonight, and to get an idea of basically whether farmers are leaving money on the table. So, Rowan, would you like to just give a quick introduction?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that, Tim. Yeah, so my name is Rowan Sprague. I'm a carbon forestry specialist at Carbon Crop. So as part of my role, I provide advice around eligibility for carbon credits for landowners, and also information about the emissions trading scheme, as well as ongoing compliance related to the emissions trading scheme as well.
Brilliant. Thanks heaps, Rowan. And for those who don't know, I'll just move my camera down a bit so I'm not looking as though I'm peeping over a wall. My name's Tim Orlando-Reep. I'm the Upper North Island Business Manager for FarmIQ and FARMAX, so FarmIQ Systems. And I'm also a beef farmer and carbon farmer in the Northwest Waikato. So I've been exposed to a bit of this stuff in the past, which has been really interesting. Just for those who don't know anything about FarmIQ or FarmIQ Systems, we're a comprehensive management solution software for farmers for recording the data on farm, and also being able to do some of that predicting modeling through the FarmAX arm of the business. So what that does is that provides a holistic image of the farm business, and it gives an idea from a people, land, and people perspective, but of course, most importantly, the profit, production, and sustainability part of it as well. And that's all in one place. So that's just a little bit about FarmIQ and the FarmAX stable. I'll pass it on. And so Rowan's going to take us through what Carbon Crop is about, and she's going to give us most of the presentation about the ETS and all that sort of stuff. And then I'll come at the end and tie that into how FarmIQ and FARMAX and Carbon Crop work together. Thanks. Who's Rowan?
Cool. Thanks, Tim. Cool. So a bit about Carbon Crop. So together with landowners around the world, we are on a mission to pull 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and lock it up in trees. So as a tech company, we use artificial intelligence and remote sensing imagery to enable landowners such as yourselves to get your forest recognized, and also earn money from carbon credits for those trees. And we're particularly focused on encouraging native forestation. So I thought I would start off with a bit about what is the emissions trading scheme, or what is the ETS. So the ETS is a way for the government to put a price on emissions. So there are some industries, such as petrol companies, who have to pay to emit. And the idea of the ETS is to incrementally limit the amount that people or companies can emit, but also increasing the price to encourage people to reduce emissions over time. So on one side, you can see we have industries who have to pay to emit, but on the other, we have landowners with forests, for example, and those forests are pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. And so landowners can be issued units or carbon credits for that carbon that is being pulled out of the atmosphere and removed. So really for when I'm talking about the ETS from now on, I'm really talking about the forestry side of it. I'm really talking about the industrial, that emissions side of it. I also thought I should mention He Waka Eke Noa as well. So He Waka Eke Noa is not part of the ETS, although it potentially will probably be connected in a way. So with the government's proposal to put a price on agricultural emissions, the government has said that the ETS is going to be the primary tool for recognizing carbon sequestration. So that means recognizing that carbon that's being pulled out of the atmosphere and put into trees. So the government has said that if you do have forests which are eligible right now for the ETS, it's a good idea to get those registered if that's what makes sense for you and for your forest, because that's how it's going to be recognized in He Waka Eke Noa. The other thing about He Waka Eke Noa is that the government has put forward at least 2 more types of carbon sequestration, which are going to be recognized after 2025. So that's riparian plantings, which are established after 2008, and also the management of native forests. So that means things like fencing and pest control will be eligible to earn carbon credits. A bit about what is eligible right now for the ETS. So there are some size requirements for forests to be eligible. So it needs to be at least 1 hectare in size, have an average width of 30 meters. The trees in the forest need to reach at least 5 meters in height once they're mature, so after about 40 years. And the forest needs to have a canopy cover of at least 30%. The other thing for eligibility is that the forest needs to be established after 1989. So that means that if an area was regenerating into native forest in the 1980s, that would not be eligible. But if it was regenerating in the 1990s or 2000s, that would be eligible. But of course, if you've planted and you have your planting records, and that's after 1989, that should be eligible as well. I did want to be upfront and say that radiata pine does earn the most carbon credits in the ETS. So radiata in New Zealand grows really, really fast. And as it's growing, it's pulling a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it as woody biomass, so in the trunks of those trees and the branches. And so it means that radiata earns the most credits. On the other hand, so native forests, they do grow slower, so they earn fewer credits. But there are a lot of co-benefits to having native forests. So for example, New Zealand's amazing biodiversity, a lot of our animals live in these native forests and rely on the habitat that these native forests provide. So there are many co-benefits of having native forests beyond just the carbon that they are sequestering. And so some of you might already have your pine trees registered in the ETS, which is great. But one of the common misconceptions that we hear is that only pine trees are eligible for the ETS. And that isn't true. Natives are also eligible. So you might be listening to this presentation and thinking, okay, I've got pine trees, but maybe that back section could be eligible now that it's regenerating. Or maybe you have a gully that is a bit marginal and kind of scrubby, but actually there are a lot of native trees coming through now. That could be potentially eligible. So have a bit of a think around what's on your property, and yeah, you might actually have more than you think you do. And I also did want to reiterate again that the ETS is not just for pines, and it's also not just pines and native trees. It could be there are a lot of other forest types which are eligible. So poplars, for example, can be eligible, redwoods, eucalypts. There's a bunch of forest types which can be eligible. And the other thing as well is that sometimes it might not be what you might traditionally think of as a forest. So some riparian plantings in some situations can be eligible. They have to meet the size requirements, and they do have to have tree species in them and meet the canopy cover requirements. But potentially they could be eligible. It just depends on what's there and how big it is. In spite of the fact that their native forests are eligible, they actually don't make up a big percentage of what is registered in the ETS. So this is data from MPI. Of all of the forests that are registered in the ETS, only 70% are native forests, which is actually quite low. We were pretty surprised to see this. But at Carbon Crop, we have estimated that there's around 150,000 hectares of native forests which are eligible for the ETS, but are not yet registered. So that represents a huge area, a significant opportunity, and it's also a lot of money. So that's around $90 million of annual native carbon credit revenue that's on the table. So going back to the title of the presentation, are you leaving money on the table? You might have a share of that $90 million that you might not really know about or might not think about, but you could be earning some money from your native forest potentially through the ETS. And at Carbon Crop, we think that there's a significant untapped opportunity of these native forests. So here is an example of some of the work that we do. So this is an analysis of a native forest looking at carbon sequestration. So the purple areas are areas that have a lower carbon sequestration. So it means that the forest is growing slower, it's probably reaching maturity, it's a bit older. But then around the edges, that's where we've identified that there's a higher sequestration rate. So that means that those forests are probably younger, they're growing faster, and they're pulling a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere. So those could be eligible for the ETS, but also they're doing some great work in terms of fighting climate change. So I thought I would talk about a case study of one of our customers. So this is Orongorongo Station, southeast of Wellington, so at the bottom of the North Island. This station was farmed in the mid to late 1900s, primarily sheep farming, but a little bit of beef cattle as well. And you can see that some of it was pretty steep country. And so because it was a bit marginal, the landowners started to remove stock in the 1990s. And as they were removing stock and stopping any vegetation clearance, those areas started to regenerate. And in the end, we were able to register 735 hectares for the station owners, which represents a bit over 175,000 tons of carbon dioxide. And that's also 175,000 carbon credits that these station owners are going to earn by 2050. So that's a lot of money and also a lot of carbon that's being removed. This is a bit of how we work. So we source aerial imagery, historic aerial imagery from many different places, and then also have present day satellite and aerial imagery. And we compare over time. Were there forests there in the 1980s, in the 1990s, and then we can figure out when the forest was established, and then our AI model maps those forest boundaries. So we're able to save a lot of time because our AI does a lot of work for us, but it also means that we can look over big properties really quickly and efficiently. So we're able to get a lot of work done with our technology. So I know that not everyone has 700 hectares of native forest. Potentially, you might have a bit of a smaller area, which is all good. So I thought I'd do a more hypothetical, smaller scale example. So let's say you have 10 hectares of native forest and it was planted in 2017. This is an example of what you would earn out to 2051. So over a decent time period, and it's around $4,000 to $12,000 per year that you'll earn. I also should point out that even though this graph is to 2051, right now at least you can earn carbon credits for native forests for 50 years. So you would be earning credits until 2067. MPI has indicated that they're looking at extending that time period. So particularly for native forests, which do usually grow for a lot longer than 50 years, we are expecting that 50 years will be lengthened out to a longer time period. So at Carbon Crop, we are really proud that we specialize in native registrations. So over 80% of the forests that we register in the ETS are for native forests, and we're also really good at it. So this is data from MPI. The data is for 2017 to Q3 for 2022. These are the acceptance rates for ETS applications of native forests. So 24% of the native forests that are applied to the ETS are accepted for everyone else, but for Carbon Crop, we get 81% acceptance rate, which is awesome, which is great. We are really good at identifying areas of native forests which are eligible, and we're good at getting it registered. So we're pretty proud of that. So this is a bit of how we work. So at Carbon Crop, we start with a free land assessment. So if you are listening to this and you're thinking, I might have some areas which are eligible, but I just am not sure, you can request a free land assessment. So there's no strings attached. We will take a look at your land, do a rough map of what we think is eligible, and let you know how much you could earn over time. And then from there, if you get the results of your free land assessment and you're keen to proceed, we can take care of the ETS application for you. So we'll do the submission to MPI. And then once you're registered, it's sort of an ongoing cycle. So we'll help you earn your credits, we'll help you sell your credits. And then we also will look after that ongoing compliance. So that's things like your annual reporting, but also if there are changes in legislation, we will let you know what they are and what they mean for you. Also, if you are already registered in the ETS, but you think you might have more forest, which could be still eligible, but isn't yet registered, again, you can put in a request for a free land assessment and we'll take a look and see if there's anything else that you could maybe get registered. So yeah, it doesn't have to be kind of an all or nothing unregistered or not registered. So if this works, we would like to do a poll. So on your screen, I think you can see, hopefully there's a chat box, and then beside that is poll. If you click on that, hopefully that is appearing for people. Yeah, you can do a poll. So the questions are you already registered in the ETS? And also a bit of a test question. If you are already registered, when do you need to submit a mandatory emissions return by this year? We'll just give you a few seconds to do the poll. Cool. Okay. So if you are already registered, the answer to that test question of when you need to file your emissions return, that's by the 30th of June. So that's this year. So if you're looking at that date and you're kind of thinking, that's a bit soon, or I'm not too sure what I need to do for this, don't worry. Please just get in touch. We're happy to help out and take a look and see what you need to do, or we can do it for you. So you can go on our website, carboncrop.nz, send us an email or put in a land assessment request, and we can also help you through there. And then also, if you are already registered, again, you're welcome to submit a free land assessment request. And again, we can take a look and see if there's other areas. If you have pine forests which are registered and you don't necessarily want to switch the administration of that to carbon crop, that's also all good. We can see about getting your native forest registered, and you don't necessarily have to switch your pine administration to us if you don't want to. So for that, really, I'm just finishing off with, at Carbon Crop, we are all about maximizing your credits and minimizing your to-do list. So put in a free land assessment request. We'll let you know what you have and what it's worth. So yeah. And I'll hand it over to you, Tim, to talk about how we'll work together.
Thanks for that, Ron.
Yeah.
Some very interesting answers coming through on the if you are already registered, when you need to submit the mandatory emissions return by. So hopefully we have enlightened you as to 30th of June this year, because if you don't, it's a major. So yeah, just make sure you keep that date in mind. So straight after duck shooting, it should be done. Yep. A good way of maybe remembering it, or maybe do it just before you get into duck shooting, and then you can enjoy yourself a bit more. Okay, so how does this all fit together? What's FarmIQ got to do this? So in the spirit of bringing everything into one place, ideally the shapefiles that are created by Carbon Crop can easily be pushed into FarmIQ. So just like we uploaded a lot of people's maps already from other providers, we can bring those in quite easily, and it's quite good to be able to visually show those layers of maps of what you're doing. So third parties, for example, if they want to have a look and see what's going on, you can just pull this up, click the right feature button, and it pops up. Or if it's too busy, you can take stuff on and take stuff off. But also for this, there's the option to measure, identify, and plan opportunity on your farm using the draw and measure feature on FarmIQ. So if you are even just, you've got the program already and you want to just say, all right, what's going to happen if I take that out? How many hectares is that going to be? How many hectares do I need to order for a planting season, and giving that really good idea of maybe setting the seed now, excuse the pun, of getting those trees going, and then be able to capitalize on that planting in the next sort of 10, 20 years. So this one, it is a bit small. I do apologize, but this is just a really good example of how you can layer that map. So on the orange here, we have space, poplar and willow plantings, which is eligible for the ETS and has been registered. So different CAAs, and I don't know if Rowan mentioned what CAA is, carbon accounting area. And so we have different carbon accounting areas. And what we've actually done on this map here is separated the poplars and willows, which you can see in orange, and then we also have the yellow, which is the Pinus radiata. So we've got two different plantations there of Pinus radiata, which when we look at the tables and the lookup tables and how much sequestering is done, there's a different level between Pinus radiata and the poplars and willows. So it makes it easier for any sort of emissions return. Also, again, we weren't going to touch on the GHG much tonight, but we can actually highlight in blue. We can see here part of the property that might be pre-1990. So what we're going to do is we actually go allocate those areas towards our GHG figure. So that's going to give us an option, and we can see that visually there as well. And then also in the top left, you'll see we have a 2023 planting organised for this winter, so we can actually map that out and talk about how big that area is and what sort of plants we're going to put in there and so forth, and even working out how much fence line we need to put in for that. So that's sort of the FarmIQ slant on that and how we bring it together. FARMAX, in a broad holistic view, and if we just go to the next slide, we've got a bit of a chart up there. We can sort of model what the carbon price or the carbon credits versus the liabilities of the farm. So again, walking that tightrope between GHG and emissions trading or ETS eligible land. But this will really give us a simplistic view of how our farm is performing on a carbon neutrality basis, I guess. And it gives us quite a good idea of how much surplus area we might have to be able to enter into the ETS or register into the ETS through that land. And when we do that, we can model different scenarios. So again, looking forward to the next 20, 30 years, we can model those scenarios and areas of forestry to see how that affects that potential carbon liability and what is surplus and what we can actually submit. So it's obviously it's a moving target at this stage. Central government's still working through e Wakakanoa, and so there's a lot of moving parts there, but in its broader sense, FarmX can sort of give you that overall understanding of where your farm fits and what sort of adjustments you can make to hit some targets or goals that you set for your farming business. So that's about it from us. Have we got any questions at all in the chat? Is anybody? No? Anything there, Rowan?
I think that there are. Okay, let's see. Okay. Why are there so few natives in the ETS? Have they only just become eligible or something? Good question. No, so natives have been eligible the same length of time as pine forests, but natives have historically been seen as being a bit harder to get registered because it can be hard to figure out what the year is when they were established. So often natives are regenerating in an area over time, and so it can be hard to kind of put a date on this is when it's a forest. The other thing is that for pines, they're often planted in neat rows, and it's very clear where the forest boundaries are. For natives, it's not always the case. It can sometimes be a bit of a gray area. For us at Carbon Crop, that's where we've really found our AI tech to really help us out, because it's very good at distinguishing what's forest and what isn't and putting those boundaries around it. So that saves us a lot of time. But I think that might be why, or at least some of the reasons why, there are not as many natives registered.
Thanks, Ron. There's another good question from Graham G. Are you referring to plantations planted post-1990 native and plant to be harvested? Is it all permanent? Is there concern about risk, pest, fire, or other disruptive event?
I'm I'm not sure if this is in relation to something specific that I said. I mean, I think, and so in general, when I'm talking about forests in the ETS, I'm primarily talking about the post-1989, so not necessarily the pre-1990 forests. And yes, so there is, in the ETS, there is now what's called the permanent category. So that means that those forests that are registered are permanent, so you can't remove them, you can't harvest them. And then concerns about pest risk, fire, and disruptive events. I mean, I think, so before this, my background was in biosecurity. So of course it is really important to be monitoring your forest, looking out for any pests. The Forest Owners Association, I know, is also very involved in that and helps a lot in terms of monitoring and reporting for potential risks to plantation forests. But in terms of events such as fire or floods or landslips or something like that, there is also now something in the ETS called temporary adverse event suspension. So that means that you can pause the issuance of your carbon credits if there is a temporary adverse event, so such as a fire, which affects your forest. So it means you don't have to pay back your credits if your forest is damaged, but you just are pausing the issuance of your credits until your forest grows back to the point where it was. I'm hoping that's answering the question.
That's a good. It's a really good, because that has changed recently as far as that pausing. So that's a good opportunity to bring up that subject. And thanks, Graham. Mirren, being longer-lived species, do native forests have the ability to sequester more carbon over time than pine forests? What do you think the possible threshold beyond 50 years for mature native forest could be?
Mm-hmm.
Very
Good question. Yeah.
Mm.
So right now with MPI's carbon lookup tables, radiata pine still sequesters the most carbon. So it's still the carbon stock of the forest at the end of 50 years is still the highest. For native forests, I'm trying to think of the data that the New Zealand, I guess New Zealand has collected on native forests. I'm still not sure if it actually still meets the level of carbon stock of a radiata pine forest after 50 years, but it definitely depends a lot on the species of native trees. So in the ETS, native forests are just grouped into one category, but actually there's quite a bit of difference in carbon sequestration and carbon stock, so the amount in total of carbon that is held in the trees. There's quite a lot of difference in species. So some of our podocarp trees, so like totara, for example, can store quite a bit, as well as beech forests. So they might store more than manuka or kanuka, for example. And then in terms of length of time, again, it depends a lot on the native species. So manuka and kanuka, actually, 50 to maybe 50 to 70 years is probably about right in terms of when they're really sequestering and pulling that carbon out of the atmosphere. But it would be much longer. For beech trees, for example, would be, I don't know, 150 years maybe. And podocarps could be longer as well. So yeah, I think 150 would be a pretty good marker in a way. It also does depend on the site, so the kind of environmental growing conditions. Yeah, but 150, 200 years, definitely.
Awesome. Thanks, Rowan. Rowan, how long does it take to get the free assessment back?
We should have that back within a week. So we have a pretty fast turnaround time.
Here you go, Bevan. Hopefully that answers that. What are the two types of forests allowable in the Iwaka Kanoa, and what are the size requirements?
Yes. So the new types of carbon sequestration that the government has proposed so far is riparian plantings that are established after 2008 and the management of native forests. And I don't think that they have specified a size requirement actually for those. It might be a hectare still, but
there's debate, I think, about that still, isn't there? About
there is,
whether, yes, yeah.
because there's
So I
debate
think it's still
about,
up in the air, but
yeah, shelter belts, whether or not they could be eligible, or small woodlots under a hectare. There's debate around that as well. At the end of last year, the government did say that they were open to recognizing all types of carbon sequestration that could be backed up by evidence. So yeah, hopefully we'll start to see more. We're really hoping that that means that there's going to be more types of carbon sequestration that's recognized, because there's certainly a lot going on. It would be nice, to see that as being either part of the ETS or somehow part of He-Wā-He-Kanoa, however that ends up being decided.
It's a slippery slope because you start talking about pasture and you can go right into the nitty gritty, can't you?
Yeah. I don't know about pasture grass, but yeah. Yeah.
Graham G, it's a good question actually, Graham. Is there a critical size area of ETS forest considering registration fees and other admin costs? And we know there are costs associated with this. So what's your idea on that?
It is a good question. Because there is also that time scale as well. So if you can enter into the ETS but earn for 50 years and have low ongoing administrative costs, it might kind of be worth it in the end. So the other thing is that with the introduction of the permanent category in the ETS, MPI has waived the fees for permanent forests. So that means that registration is free, filing an emissions return is free. If you want to add areas to the permanent forest, that is also free. So in terms of this kind of administrative fees, permanent forest could be a good option. But I guess the ETS is complicated. So we do find that it can be, I guess, peace of mind for a lot of people to have a forestry consultant such as Carbon Crop manage forests for them. So I guess that's just kind of something to take into account. But I'd say it's probably like a pretty relatively low size of forest to kind of meet that threshold of when does it make sense kind of thing. But yeah.
And look, speaking from experience, Graham, I've gone through the process myself, and it's very complicated. If you can get the professionals to do it for you, I would be giving them a ring, because it does make life a lot easier. There's a really good question here, which I've got a preconceived answer based on supply and demand and basic economics. But what are the implications of the latest ETS carbon auction?
Yeah, it's a good question. Okay, so I guess a bit of context. So last Wednesday was the first ETS auction of the year. So the ETS auction is a government-run auction. It's really for the industry people. So if you remember at the beginning, I was talking about industries which have to pay to be able to emit. So those industries participate in a government auction and they buy units that enables them to emit whatever amount of units that they purchase. So at the auction last week, the auction failed. So there were no government units that were sold. And really what I think at least it means is that the industries were not willing to buy the units at the price that the government set. So the industry thought that whatever price it was that the government put out, which was confidential before the auction, that price was seen as too high. However, since then, we have seen actually an increase in the spot price for NZUs. That's the spot price for the carbon credits. That has actually gone up by a few dollars. So yeah, kind of hoping that there will be really nice if there will be a bit more certainty in the market. Basically, there's just a bit of uncertainty right now about the carbon price. But in saying that, the carbon price is still much higher than it has been. If you look at what it was at 2 years ago, it still is higher. So like the trend is over time and it's going up. It just has been a bit rockier than maybe we thought it would be.
Yeah.
And yeah, Tim, if you have opinions on it, welcome to jump in.
Oh, no, I'm going to stay well out of that one. Yeah. Okay. No, I'm going to go listen to the experts on this one. A couple of good questions are quite well related. How does Carbon Crop charge for your service?
Yeah, good question. I should have covered that in the presentation. So we don't have any upfront fees. So we only earn once our customers do. So we charge a small percentage of the units that are earned each year. And so our service fee depends on the size of forest that's registered. But yeah, we think it's a really great thing for you all that there's no upfront cost, so you don't really have to pay anything going into it. It's only once you're paid that we get paid.
Brilliant. Another good question. How do you work out average sequestration for a mixed species forest? I'm presuming you're talking native Glen bee, but it'd be good to talk about maybe exotics and native mixed as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Or different kind of exotics.
Yeah. So in the ETS, there are 5 different general forest types. So there's native forest, so all native species are grouped into one. Pinus radiata, which depends on the different rates depend on the region. There's other exotic softwoods, so it's kind of other types of pine trees, for example, Douglas fir, and also exotic hardwoods. So that'd be things like eucalyptus, for example. So if you have a forest, let's say you map out your forest, and it has different forest types in here. So there's some pines and there's some natives. If the areas are over 1 hectare, you need to map them out separately and then report on them. The reason for that is that those carbon sequestration rates are different depending on the forest type. So you have to report. You can't kind of map out everything as a pine forest and then earn a bunch of credits, even if they're not all pine forests. You do have to map correctly for what is each forest type. In terms of natives, if it's a mix of tree species, let's say maybe you have regenerating manuka and potentially there's some podocarps coming through there, for example, or it's a mix of broadleaf and podocarps, that is all kind of treated as just one native forest type. So they don't necessarily have to map out these different tree species. It's just all grouped together into the indigenous or the native forest type.
Brilliant. And I guess that sort of leads on to Rebecca's question here. Wilding pines scattered through a native gully. What's the best practice there?
Yeah, so my background is actually in wilding pines, so I would say you should maybe drill the wilding pines and get rid of them. But so in a case like this, wilding pines are considered tree weeds, so the pines are not eligible. But you could drill those trees, for example, and still register the gully of natives. And so you would earn credits based on the native forest there, but you would need to make sure that you were removing the wilding pines because you couldn't register that forest as a wilding pine forest. That wouldn't be eligible.
Yeah. Miriam, another quite good question here. How confident can farmers be in the carbon market, and how significant is the government's policy settings on the New Zealand carbon market at the moment? And this comes up quite a few times, I think, in the last sort of 6 months. There's been a lot of chat around it.
There has. Yeah. So towards the end of last year, the government made an announcement about their ETS settings. So this is particularly in regards to the government auctions. So the government did not follow what the Climate Change Commission recommended. So the Climate Change Commission recommended basically limiting the supply of units that were sold in auctions and also increasing the price of those units. The government decided not to follow that. I personally think that they were quite concerned about cost of living, which makes sense. But what it meant was that the market responded by a decent drop in the price of carbon. Because I think that we were all expecting that the government was going to follow the Climate Change Commission's, or a lot of us were expecting the government to follow the Climate Change Commission's advice, and it didn't. And so what that means is that the units are not being limited as much as we had thought that they were going to be, and that trigger price at the auctions is not as high as we had thought it was going to be. So yeah, there definitely is a bit of uncertainty. At the same time, the ETS is one of the government's primary tools for reducing emissions. And so I do think that it doesn't mean that the ETS is going to fail altogether or that we're not going to have it anymore. And I do think that the carbon price will continue to go up. It just is not going up as quick as we had thought. So yeah, definitely there is uncertainty, but I don't think it's the end of the world or that we're all doomed or anything like that. I think that yeah, we still have our obligations in terms of reducing emissions. That's not going away, and the ETS is one of the primary tools to do that. So it just maybe not quite the way that we had thought.
Awesome. Thanks, Ro.
Yeah.
Sarah, but like catching up, we will send out a recording of this afterwards, so you'll get the whole shebang, which would be fantastic. What price per tonne did we use in the 10 hectare example? Was that the current price you used, or was that?
I think it was. So it would either have been something like $65 or $70 per ton.
It'd be pretty easy to work it backwards, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Grain crops or seasonal crops be eligible going forward? We sort of touched on that, but
Yeah. So I don't think so, at least for now. So I think the reason being that the reason why we are trying to kind of, I guess we're really all about trying to get carbon sucked out of the atmosphere and then stored as permanently as possible. And it means that trees, those things with a lot of woody material, they are storing a lot of carbon. So the carbon is stored in that woody material. So if you have a seasonal crop, which doesn't have that woody material, but also it doesn't have the permanence either, so it's not storing carbon permanently, that just means that it's actually not really removing that amount of carbon out of the atmosphere that I guess that we can register in the ETS or as part of Hiwaka Kanoa. Hope that answers.
To be continued, I guess. That's again, I think you touched on it before, Rowan. The science is still needs to catch up, I guess, with that. So
yeah, and there's work going on soil carbon and things like that. So I guess watch the space, because there's definitely potential for more types of carbon that can be, or carbon sequestration that can be recognized.
Yeah, I should probably say the acceptance of science, not the science. I think the science is already there. It's the acceptance of science from a central level.
Yeah.
Mike W., what in 15, 20 years, we talked about the storm and the pausing on the emissions. Do you just quickly want to go over that again, or do you think I think we've sort of covered that?
Yeah, so that's about a temporary adverse event. So you can suspend your carbon credits now. So yeah, which is actually, I think, a really great option. So it means you don't have to pay back the units if half your forest falls down in an unexpected event.
Is there a way to work with a company to offset emissions that don't involve the ETS?
Yes, I think that you could. So the ETS is what's called a compliance market. There's also a voluntary carbon market. So the voluntary carbon market is really more for companies who want to voluntarily offset their emissions. And so, for example, potentially you could have a forest and use that as an offset for a company's emissions. You'd have to make sure that you are correctly quantifying the amount of carbon. And there also are, because the voluntary carbon market is unregulated, you need to make sure that you're following a standard, or you're doing something basically in a legit way. You're not just kind of being like, yeah, that's 100 tons. Yeah, but it is possible. So it's not like everything has to go through the ETS. The voluntary carbon market is also another option, and it can be actually a really good opportunity as well. You just have to have the robust processes to back it up. And yeah.
Awesome. At what time is a newly planted block eligible?
Yeah, it's basically when you plant it, you can register it as long as it meets the size requirements. And it's tree species, and you're planting them at enough density that it will become a forest and will, again, meet the size criteria. But yeah, if you planted something in this coming winter, for example, you could register it as soon as you plant it. It does mean that you probably would have to either have like drone footage or ground photos to support and have the evidence to show that, yes, you did plant them, because it won't come up on satellite imagery or aerial imagery. But yeah, they're eligible as soon as you plant.
Yeah, just remember the earning capacity of those young plants is very, very small. So it's going to take a while to take off.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah.
The earning capacity of ETS forest will continue or cease once the growth has matured, noting discussion about additionality. There is a limited life in earning capacity, i.e. not perpetual.
Yes. So when the forest is growing, that's when it is sequestering a bunch of carbon. So that's when it's really removing a lot of carbon. But at some point, the forest reaches maturity. And so that is kind of like it is a steady state in a way. So there still will be some young trees, for example, that are growing and pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. But there also might be some trees are old, they fall over, they start to decay and release carbon. And so there's a bit of a flux there. So that's why after, at least for right now, after 50 years, that's when you stop earning units. So that's when that forest has reached maturity. It's no longer, well, according to the lookup tables, it's no longer sequestering carbon. And so you're not earning anything after that. But you still are required to maintain that forest. So to keep that forest there. You can't necessarily just chop it all down and plant another one. So if you did chop it down, for example, you'd have to pay back the units. Yes, that's the way that it is. That's the way that it works. There is that permanence obligation.
It's an interesting one. Could urban forests be eligible in the future?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, I guess it would. Yeah, I'm not actually entirely sure how that would work because in an urban setting, there'd be a lot of different like title owners in a way, like it wouldn't just be like one person owns a giant, like a hectare, unless maybe in an urban setting, potentially on the edges of a city, you might have someone with a hectare of a forest, but yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not really sure how that would work.
That'll be Auckland Council might be all over that just to be able to pay for everything else. So yeah, you might
yeah, maybe the council could like
they'll claim all your trees if you live in town.
Yeah, if there's like a reserve, I don't know.
Now, this is a good one. Can I space plant poplars into my regenerative manuka to increase my credits? You're going into a mixed sward of tree.
Yeah. So if it's mixed in that way, it would depend on what is the dominant tree species. So if you planted enough poplar, that poplar was dominant, then you'd register that area as exotic hardwoods. So it would be a poplar. If you had planted it not in a high enough density and manuka was the dominant species, then it will be registered as indigenous. So it would be a bit of a calculation to figure out if you were wanting to earn more units, I guess, than a native forest, you would have to plant the poplars at enough density so that that would be the dominant tree species. But it can be done.
And it is quite a clever way because you'd expect after sort of 30, 40 years, those poplars are renowned for falling over and then the native will just generally take over after a while. So, yeah.
Yeah, so you could maybe... MPI has been talking about providing guidance on transitioning forests. So let's say you have an exotic forest and you're transitioning it to a native. We're still not quite sure how that will work in terms of carbon credits. Like how you would I guess you could keep earning, but maybe kind of switch forest types. Yeah. So they've talked about providing guidance, but it's not there yet. But yeah, watch the space. We'll see.
Rebecca, can you explain the phase 1 product native CCU product that Carbon Crop offers and when will you open phase 2?
Yes. Okay, so earlier I did mention the voluntary carbon market. So at Carbon Crop, we launched what we call CCU, so carbon crop units. We launched phase 1 of that last year. So that was our voluntary carbon market product offering. And so with CCUs, it is recognizing pre-1990 regenerating native forests. So if you remember at the beginning, I talked about the ETS eligibility criteria, and the forest has to be established after 1989. In doing these assessments, we realized that there were a lot of native forests that were still growing, but couldn't clearly have an establishment date that was after 1989. And so they were considered pre-1990, but because they were still regenerating, they were still growing, we kind of thought, there should be a way to recognize this. So that's when we launched CCUs, carbon crop units. For phase 1 last year, we got a huge amount of interest, which was awesome. We got a lot of interest from landowners. And so we're kind of catching up with that right now. So we're still working on what our phase 2 offering is going to look like. So yeah, I guess kind of keep your eyes on this space. We will provide updates. We're working on that. But yeah, we are also working on finding, I guess, kind of like showing the value and getting these forests recognized is really important to us. And potentially in the future, this could be something that's recognized under Hiwaka Kanoa or eventually in the ETS. So if you can prove that a pre-1990 native forest is still growing, possibly that will be eligible. We're not too sure, but yeah, we do think that it's really important to restore these forests, to protect these forests. So yeah, watch the space. We're working on our next the next product in this.
Awesome. Anita asks, do you have regenerating native through gorse registered? Can your technology recognize the difference between gorse and native trees?
Yes. So yes, we can differentiate gorse from native trees. So we actually have like a species identification model, which is really cool and works really well. And so yes, if we do identify that there are native trees coming up through gorse, that is eligible, and we can map out those areas and get them registered. If it's just gorse, that gorse on its own is not eligible, but yeah, we are finding that definitely, I mean, it depends on the site, but there are definitely sites where gorse does act as a nurse crop. And so it's a really great way actually to kind of let nature do its thing and let the natives come up through the gorse and then register it in the ETS.
So that brings up another valid question. Right, if you're a bit suspect of something, do you go out and ground truth yourselves, or is that liability on the landowner based on the information they've given you?
So we can go and do a site visit, for example, and make sure everything's there. We also can request that landowners go and take some ground photos and send them to us so we can have a check and see. And that's often a low cost way for us, because if we're going to do a site visit, then potentially that adds costs onto registration. And yeah, we want to try to keep our costs down and keep the ETS as accessible as possible for people. So often if a landowner can go and take a photo and send it to us, that's a really great way for us just to check and make sure and kind of see, especially looking at what species are growing there, what's happening in the forest stage, things like that. And then also can help in terms of providing evidence for the ETS application.
Yeah, because if you're starting to think, oh, well, I'm going to try to work the system a bit, and then you get audited, you'll find you've got a massive fine and the whole thing was not worth it. So just be careful there if you are thinking about trying to find a shortcut, because it doesn't work.
Yeah. There's definitely no shortcuts. Yeah. But yeah, I guess we're trying to kind of find that sweet spot between as much of the tech, that has, I guess, as far as that can bring us, and then supplementing that if we need additional evidence.
In the voluntary market, can you have smaller areas than an ETS?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can in theory. Yeah, so as long as you have a way of robustly quantifying the carbon that's sequestered, in theory, yes, there's not necessarily the size requirements in the voluntary carbon market as what there is in the ETS. The voluntary carbon market is also not just for forest sequestration. There's a lot of other types of carbon sequestration, or a lot of other types of, I guess, like carbon credits in the voluntary carbon market. So there can be things for renewable energy, for example. So yeah, there's not necessarily those eligibility requirements as the ETS.
What ETS lookup tables are being used for national reporting?
So the MPI provides those carbon lookup tables. So it's in the legislation if you wanted to have a look, but yeah, MPI also has them on their website. It's they have a set of tables for radiata pine, because they have different rates for different regions of the country. Then they have those 4 different forest types as well. So Douglas fir, other exotic softwoods, exotic hardwoods, and native forests.
Can I do anything to make my native block grow faster and earn more credit? Sort of ties into those lookup tables, I guess, a bit.
Yeah.
Sort of stymied by what they sequest.
So I should also mention that if you have over 100 hectares, you actually go out and you have to set up measurement plots. You measure your forest, and then MPI generates specific carbon lookup tables for your forest. So you will have a sequestration rate for your forest. If you have under 100 hectares, then yeah, you will just use those default lookup tables. So if your native forest is under 100 hectares, you could be doing things like enrichment planting, so planting canopy species such as podocarps into your regenerating native forest, for example, or you could fence. But if you're doing those things and you had under 100 hectares, it wouldn't necessarily matter. You would still be using the default lookup tables. But if you have over 100 hectares registered, then yes, I would recommend potentially thinking about things like fencing, doing pest control as well. So you're making sure, especially deer, those herbivores that like to munch on the tasty native trees, controlling for deer and things like that. And then also doing enrichment planting. So again, planting those canopy species that could potentially help earn more credits and boost your sequestration rates.
And that's under the acronym FMA, isn't it, Rowan?
Yes.
The field management, field measurement approach.
That's right. So if you hear someone talking about FMA, that's for those areas that are over 100 hectares. That's setting up plots and measuring them.
Jerry asks, will companies pay more for Indigenous units than as opposed to exotic units?
It is definitely possible. So we are thinking that there could potentially be a premium as long as you can prove that those units are from Indigenous forest. Possibly those could sell for a premium price. NZUs they will be tagged if they're from a permanent forest, but they're not necessarily tagged if it's from exotic or native. But if you are a landowner and you know you have native forest registered, then you could potentially try to see if you could sell them for a premium. I think that's definitely possible.
Walnuts?
Okay. So fruit and nut trees, if they are managed as productive fruit and nut trees, are not eligible for the ETS. If you have walnut trees and you actually are not really managing them for the walnut production, so you're just letting them grow, you're not pruning them, potentially they could be eligible, but you'd have to prove that you aren't pruning them, you're letting them grow to be big, tall trees. But generally, as a rule, fruit and nut trees are not eligible.
About the CCU, are you talking about forests getting denser or getting larger in size? If getting larger in size, would that be a new registration?
So about the CCUs, those are areas that are regenerating pre-1990. And when I say regenerating, I mean that they're still growing. So the trees themselves will be getting larger. So the trees will be growing taller and taller. If the forest itself was getting larger, so if it was regenerating into more areas, those new regenerating areas would then probably be eligible for the ETS. And so we would look at registering them in the ETS. I think that would be the newly regenerating areas would be new ETS registrations, if that makes sense.
Awesome. Mike asks, are carbon crop arrangements and obligations transferable on sale or succession?
Yes, that's a great question. Yes, they are. Yeah. So let's say, for example, you have an ETS registered forest. You could decide to sell that. And if you were a customer of Carbon Crop, you could also transfer that carbon crop agreement to the new buyer, just as you would for your ETS participation.
Awesome. And luckily last, Rebecca H asked, you mentioned a temporary something to apply. I'm presuming the pause on any damage. If some of my trees have fallen down, do I have to fly a drone over to check and take photos, or can your satellites do that? Yeah.
So we at Carbon Crop don't necessarily have our own satellite, but that would be pretty cool.
Make
But
life a lot easier.
Yeah, we can get imagery from satellites. But so let's say, for example, if you were affected by the recent cyclone, the government actually has already gone and flown a bunch of those areas already. So there already is aerial imagery available for those areas. And so you can use that imagery to map out if there's been a section of your forest which has fallen over. If there was some other type of event, then yes, we could use satellite imagery to map it and then provide that as the evidence to MPI that there has been this event. If you want, you can provide ground photos, but I think if the imagery is sufficient, I don't think you would necessarily need them. But they wouldn't harm your application. You could certainly submit them and just provide them as additional evidence.
Awesome. Interesting one about what we're talking about for the field management approach. Does Carbon Crop carry these out, and is it inclusive of the percentage of your take?
Yes, the way that we work is that if there are those additional fees, that it would come out of the net unit entitlement that would be earned. So we at Carbon Crop would manage the FMA for you if you were one of our customers. So we would manage getting the plots from MPI and figuring out what needs to be measured, getting them measured, and getting that data to MPI. But the cost of doing FMA would come out of the unit entitlement. So you wouldn't necessarily have to front up the costs. Carbon Crop would cover all the upfront costs associated with FMA. But once you would receive your units, we would take the cost of the FMA out of the net unit entitlement. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, awesome. Look, I think that's that. Look, I'm very impressed with the amount of questions that came out of there. It was great, and I think we all took quite a bit out of that. So thanks very much for your time, Rowan. I hope you've got a glass of water there. You've done a lot of talking.
I've got a cup of tea.
Hopefully it's still warmish. Look, thanks very much, everybody, for coming out tonight. It's been a real pleasure to have you, Rowan. And again, if you have any questions at all, feel free to get in touch with Rowan from Carbon Crop and Google it, or carboncrop.nz, I think it was. And also, of course, FarmIQ. You know where we are. Come and have a yarn and let's have a chat. So thanks very much. Have a good night, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Tim. And yeah, thank you everyone for coming. It's been awesome. And yeah, really great questions. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. See you, everybody.
See ya.